Good. Well, I think we should begin. So welcome everybody to this inaugural event celebrating the 20th anniversary of CRASSH. I'm Andrew Webber. I'm Professor of Modern German and Comparative Culture here at Cambridge, a past interim director of CRASSH, a long-standing member of its management committee, and like many of you, I'm one of the beneficiaries of the Centre's remarkable set of activities over the last 2 decades. Now, before we start the event proper, just a few housekeeping points for participants. I think your cameras and microphones are switched off automatically, but they should be kept switch off, please. The event will be recorded by Zoom, and the recording will be available after the event. Questions can be asked through the Q&A function. And we'd very much appreciate if you could complete a short feedback questionnaire after this session, and the link to the survey will be sent to you via Eventbrite. So this event has the title Humanities Futures, and we could understand this in 2 ways. First, how the humanities, broadly understood, should be shaped for the future. And second, the necessity for our futures to be shaped by the humanities. We use the term shape here, it's with a nod to the not yet fully established acronym proposed by the British Academy and UK Research and Innovation as a counterpart to STEM, SHAPE, social sciences, humanities, and the arts for people and the economy. How our own playfully anarchic acronym, CRASH, might stand in relation to SHAPE or indeed STEM, and indeed the relationship between the two, is a question in itself. Now, this event gives an opportunity to learn from past experience through those who have steered CRASSH and its innovations over its first 2 decades, and to consider what directions we might anticipate for the futures of research in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and the role that CRASSH might continue to play as a leading laboratory for the development of such futures. Today, we sadly miss Professor Ian Donaldson, the inspirational founding director of CRASSH, who died last year. Our 4 speakers are, however, a powerful team. This in terms of individual scholarly distinction in their home fields, and in each case, testing field boundaries through the sort of interdisciplinary work that CRASSH has always nurtured, and also in their ability to give leadership to that kind of boundary challenging work, both nationally and internationally. So just by way of brief introduction, and this is in order of tenure of the directorship, we welcome Ludmilla Jordanova, who succeeded Ian Donaldson in 2003 as director of CRASSH. She's Professor Emerita in Visual Culture in the Department of History at Durham, and interim director of the Centre for Visual Arts and Culture there. She works across the intersection between histories of science, medicine, and art, and her scholarship on early modern portraits and other visual cultural artifacts has made an important contribution to the visual turn in the discipline of history. Mary Jacobus is Emerita Grace II Professor of English in Cambridge and Emerita Professor of English at Cornell. Her work ranges from Romanticism to contemporary writing, engaging with feminism, continental and British psychoanalysis, and visual culture indeed. And she's done so much to redefine her own discipline and the relationship of that home discipline with others through that interdisciplinary work. Simon Goldhill is Professor in Greek Literature and Culture in the Cambridge Classics faculty. His extensive and influential work on classical Greek culture has also engaged with its afterlives, not least in the social and cultural structures of Victorian Britain. And his portfolio includes also a fine book on the city of Jerusalem. And finally, our current director, Steve Connor, who succeeded Mary Jacobus as Grace II Professor of English, and whose prodigious scholarly versatility is in evidence in the several books published just in the last 6 years on topics from the voice to numbers, and most recently a volume on the madness of knowledge, on wisdom, ignorance, and fantasies of knowledge, and another on the topic of giving way. Now, I'm sure our discussion today will be more on the side of wisdom than on that of fantasies of knowledge, although we might fantasize a little as well in thinking about futures. And also that our speakers will both hold forth in that wisdom and know when to give way. We'll start with a 5-minute position statement on our topic of humanities futures from each of them, followed by an opportunity for them to engage in exchange with each other. This will then lead to an open floor discussion where I'll channel questions from you to the 4 panelists, either individually or collectively. Please do use the Q&A function to put your questions forward in readiness for them to be addressed in the discussion. And we'll get to as many of these as we can. So without further ado, over to you, Ludmilla, for your statement.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the current CRASSH team for organizing this event, and to thank Andrew for his very generous introduction. He raised the question of STEM, which is of particular interest to me because I was trained in Cambridge in history and philosophy of science. And that's not a topic I'm going to talk about in my 5 minutes, but I'd be very interested if anyone wanted to pick up in the discussion what I think is a really important issue about the relationships between humanities, social sciences, and the juggernaut that is STEM. I'd also like to join Andrew in paying tribute to Ian Donaldson, who died nearly a year ago, and we remember him with great appreciation. And I wanted to comment a little bit on a feature of CRASSH, and I think of interdisciplinary work that we maybe take for granted, which is that these things don't happen by virtue of individuals, they're team efforts. And so I wanted to acknowledge the support and help that we had in the early days at CRASSH from the supporting committees and from all the administrators. And I especially wanted to acknowledge on this occasion the contribution of Catherine Hurley, who was the most wonderful and supportive colleague. Now, when I joined CRASSH in 2003, it's worth remembering that it was still a very new venture. And at that time, the name was constantly commented upon. I rather hope that that's died down now. Now, that name, which I don't want to dwell on the name and how we might have chosen something different, or indeed on the acronym and the smiles that it elicits, but just to say that every single element of the centre's name, every term, we could debate endlessly. And so we could do the same with interdisciplinarity. So for me, what remains important is not the exact terminology, but having the humanities and arts yoked to the social sciences. And increasingly in retrospect, I value that initial yoking together. And I value it because I see it as a way of resisting fragmentation. New fields and subfields with journals, organizations, websites, and so on are constantly coming into being. Partly they do so responsively to our concerns, and that's totally understandable. But I think there's also a danger of splitting, of separating people, ideas, and approaches into silos, leading us to lose a generous embrace that I think is so important. And if we are to have a public purpose, which I strongly believe that we must, then I think the arts and humanities are stronger in close association with the social sciences. And this is not just for the methodological and theoretical gains that we might have as a result. I think it's partly because of the social sciences' greater experience in speaking to governments and NGOs, in playing a constructive part in policy making. And I define policy making broadly defined, in helping to shape a public debate. And I think that that greater experience is valuable to the arts and humanities, where such experience certainly exists, but I would suggest to a lesser degree. So I think that making common cause across the arts, humanities, and social sciences is simply a smart thing to do. A major role then for centres such as CRASSH has been, and I hope will continue to be, bringing people, fields, and concerns together in timely and perhaps more important yet, in unexpected ways. And if I look back at my time at CRASSH, I think there's one event which for me was, I actually find, as you can tell, I find it hard to express how important this was. And this was when Kenneth Kaunda and Peter Carrington, Lord Carrington, came to CRASSH in a visit 50 years after the declaration of UDI in what was then Rhodesia. Now, what strikes me about that event is that it was instigated and organized by a graduate student. So that leads me to reflect on the constituencies that CRASSH and other such centers serve. So I've already indicated that I think the public is a high priority. But what about within the academy? So in my time at CRASSH, I placed particular emphasis on early career researchers. And I remain so glad to have done that, since they were sources of inspiration and wonderful ideas. I can't help but observe how it is getting ever tougher during the early years of an academic career. Yet how intellectually sophisticated, how original, how interdisciplinary those I have had a chance to work with are. So CRASSH can, I think, and should, nurture such talent. So I suppose my three key points are the role of centres in supporting integrative, holistic, ambitious, interdisciplinary work, and especially work that might find difficulty finding other homes or another home. The second point is a constant engagement with the nature of public purpose. And I think people who are going to speak are going to pick up on that. And the third point is nurturing early career researchers, since they are our future. It's been really wonderful for me to see CRASSH go from strength to strength. So in closing, I'd simply like to pay tribute to my brilliant successors. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ludmilla, and that's a nice cue to hand over to your immediate successor, Mary.
Ludi, thank you for saying so many really important things, and I just want to say that I think your focus on the early career researchers has been crucial and continues to be. I looked online and looked at the networks, for instance, and archives of the disappeared health medicine and agency subaltern and decolonial citizenship and so on, the way that those ideas are being generated, as it were, from, I won't say the bottom up, but from the early career researchers, often out ahead of us in their thinking. And of course, the emphasis on collaborative and multidisciplinary work, which has produced such energetic and transformative initiatives in the humanities, is also, I think, crucial. And I use the humanities sense in a rather, the humanities term in a rather Americanized sense, which does absolutely include the social sciences. So I just want to pick up on some of the issues, and maybe at risk of getting ahead onto Simon's focus on collaboration and on the what for question, what are the humanities for? Now, it's no secret, I think, that that collaborative projects in the humanities have been driven by two very powerful funding engines. the European Research Council, and the Mellon Foundation, and of course, British counterparts, very much less well funded, unfortunately. But I think it's not just a matter of an emphasis on collaboration. The generation of new ideas has come from a very lively engagement with topical issues, for instance, climate change or migration or racial injustice or the politics of the internet. Now, the Mellon Foundation, as well as taking the temperature of the present state of the humanities, often acts as a bellwether for a progressive and a future-oriented agenda in the humanities. So most recent initiatives I looked up to see what they've been doing. I get their communications too. The most recent initiatives include Global Humanities and Just Futures. These, I would say, campaigning initiatives also are undergirded by a transformative vision that is global, social, and domestic. And of course, among domestic, I would point to the prominence of Black Lives Matter as a really focused agenda in the US, and I think in the UK too. Now, to state the obvious, and I think we have to, this must surely be the single most disastrous year anyone born since World War II has experienced. As a result of a global pandemic, racial and social inequalities and exclusions have been vividly, tragically visible on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed globally, along with really stunning convulsions in democracy. And of course, here I'm speaking from somebody in the US. The what-for-ness of the humanities now seems with particular urgency to concern democracy and what I'll call for short access, I think a term that's often used in the UK. And it's with the realization that a global pandemic strikes hardest at people and countries that are most vulnerable, most lacking access to housing, work, healthcare, most obviously, education, economic prosperity, and the rights of citizenship. So in this connection, I'd like to say something about the public humanities. This is a really hard nettle to grasp. I always found it so myself in practice. UK universities don't tend to get involved in their local or regional context in the way that public universities or large universities or universities in large cities tend to do in the US. And they tend to take it as part of their mission to engage with the communities surrounding them and indeed with the diverse student body that they have. So with this in mind, I looked up the 16 successive projects funded by Mellon under their Just Futures competition, funded at the level of $2 million, $3 million, and $4 million. Let me read two titles to you, not quite at random, but they're both strikingly community-based and I would say reparative in their focus. So here's one: Cross-Border Movements, Racism, Dispossession, and Migration. And that aims to turn the university itself into a living laboratory for examining histories and instances of racism, dispossession, and migration, and to acknowledge university's own role in these losses. It just happens to be Cornell. Or this one, I had no hand in it. Or this one, Creativity in the Time of COVID-19, Art as a Tool for Combating Inequality and Injustice. aiming to collect the music, art, journal writing, protest posters, videos, TikTok videos, photos produced by students as a way to deal with the challenges of the pandemic and patterns of discrimination that happens in Michigan State. Now, I want to end by noting that the list of topics generated to kick off this event and our discussions as talking heads with you, the public, contains a sort of provocative subtext, even a hint of what you might call humanities fatigue. So I will just notice some of the parenthetical remarks in this list that we were sent. Are the humanities becoming past blind? Is it more important for the humanities to be interesting than important? Is the idea of interdisciplinarity approaching exhaustion? Is there a public for the humanities? And then somewhat impatiently, what are the humanities for? What are the humanities for? Anyway, one might say. What if we were to answer yes, 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 no, and well, not much? What would that mean? Or what if we answer something like this? Humanities centers as the place where humanities research gets practice, most freed from curricular and disciplinary constraints, has the potential to spearhead change, precisely by being a bit out ahead of disciplinary practices, a bit beside or even outside the university, that is future-oriented, even as they address the past in order to better understand the present. That includes disasters and accumulated injustices that have literally undermined the health of global society and led to an epidemic of political misinformation from which there seems to be no effective vaccine. So next up, humanities in the time of COVID.
Okay, many thanks, Mary, for your thoughts. And we'll hand over to Simon next.
Hello, thanks to everybody, and particular thanks in retrospect to all the staff. I miss you all, not every day, but when I do, quite strongly. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk first about collaboration and second about something we might call instrumentality. Now, Ludmilla talked already about the importance of interdisciplinarity. Well, I actually think disciplinarity, first of all, is what you need. You need to have something to bring to the table. And what interests me about collaboration is two things at this point about why I think collaboration matters. The first is that it enables you to ask different questions. It requires imagination, it requires something you can genuinely do. There's no point in having 5 people working together who all do the same thing. That might as well just get one person to work 5 times as hard. The point about collaboration is actually the very hard work of finding new questions that require different people in the same room. And one of the saddest experiences I had, one might as well be uncelebratory for a moment, was going around as head of CRASSH to a series of universities, particularly in America, where the dean would say to me, well, CRASSH seems a very exciting place. But when I turn to my humanities scholars and say, what can I do for you? They spend 3 weeks talking and come up with, could we have one more line in romantic poetry? That seems to me to be exactly the way not to do collaboration, not to understand the sorts of questions that Mary just talked about. But what it then involves is pragmatics, not just the economic basis that Mary mentioned quite correctly. When I left CRASSH, we'd had 7 ERC projects, more than many small countries have. And it was a great learning experience in terms of how do you actually get people to work together for 5 years. There's such a strong inherited imagination of the lonely scholar in often his garret, putting his feet into cold water to stay awake to study all night. And actually coming to a room for 5 years to work together to think together, to produce collaborative work, is a complex technical problem which has solutions that we need to think about. And we hear far too much talk about interdisciplinarity as an aim, and far too little talk about the imagination that's required to get real questions, and the pragmatics that are required to get real answers. And it seems to me that a place like CRASSH is one of the places that can do both very, very well. And that seems to me to be something to be celebrated. The second thing I want to talk about, I call instrumentality. I don't think it's very hard to defend the humanities at all. If we think STEM subjects explain the world through materiality, as they largely do, or through number, then humanities, broadly conceived, explains the world through social, political, psychological, and imaginative forces. Seems to me you can't understand any of the major problems that are facing the world without both of those together. And I don't see any problems at all in defending that at that level. Seems to me to be obvious. I've never heard anybody attack it at that level, quite frankly, not really. But the question would be, let's imagine where humanities has made the sort of difference that we were asked to think about. Well, I guess immediately in my lifetime, and I'm old enough to be able to say this, but I think Ludmilla and Mary and Stephen might say the same, that two of the major changes in society today that we have experienced has been the growth and success of feminism and the growth and success of gay rights, both of which are unfinished business for sure, but both of which have been amazingly successful. And if you asked about the instrumentality, the causality, you would be a very strange person indeed if you didn't think that along with activism and law, the work of the humanities in terms of teaching at universities, in terms of books published, in terms of plays and films and television, and the discussion of plays and films and television was absolutely instrumental in all of those developments. What is less easy to show is how any particular instrumentality functioned, what that book in itself actually achieved, as opposed to the collective of our work together. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to explain, research, think about quite hard is the sort of instrumentality we talk about when we say, how do we matter? How do we change the imagination of a community? Well, it's clear that, as it were, to feminism to take hold and for gay rights to take hold involves a change in the imagination, a change in the concept of how society might work. And that came about through the work of humanities and social sciences scholars, as well as other people, activists and law changers. And we need to think about how hard it is to explain that instrumentality. So for me, as Mary began to say, there are some absolutely fundamental questions facing us today in terms of racism, in terms of climate change, in terms of inequality. We know what those questions are. This is not a surprise. But the question of what the instrumentality is that's going to face them needs some real thought. And that's where I think a research center can do something that courses, that universities don't do in the ordinary way. And it seems to me that as we look forward, it's going to be the way in which we contribute to those major questions that is going to demonstrate our effectiveness, our importance in the world. But it's not going to do it if we take a naive instrumental value that says, what did experiment A produce in results B? Just not the way our work goes. Nor is it going to be any good if we just turn around and go, what we teach is critical thinking. We actually have to explain how the work of the imagination, the work of thinking better and thinking about the better is something that we help produce. For me at the moment, one of the crucial questions facing humanities after COVID is a very old-fashioned question indeed. It's actually Plato's question. And that is, what is a good city? And it seems to me that to answer that question, what is a good city, is a classic way in which a research center can begin to think, bringing together the social sciences, the hard sciences, the practical sciences, along with political science, the imagination, the arts, the humanities. And without all of those acting together, we have absolutely no chance of turning what is an offensively trivial slogan, build back better, into something that actually has some heft. Thank you.
Many thanks, Simon. And so the torch has passed along the boxes at the top of the screen here, and it finishes, I say the torch rather than the chalice, with you, Steve. You are the holder of that instrument currently. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. It's not often nowadays I feel like a new boy, as I do as the most recent incumbent as director of CRASSH, or semi-recumbent, perhaps, as Lady Bracknell might say. So I feel minded to start with a bit of sort of, before looking forward, with a bit of dignifying longue durée, a bit of personal paleontology. So I began academic study, I was an undergraduate, from 1973. And the experience that I had as an undergraduate, perhaps it wasn't everybody's experience studying English in 1973, but the experience was of 3 years and more of the floor falling away from under me. Everything that I thought the study of literature would involve, in my case, painfully and autodidactically acquired through a kind of under the bedclothes reading of people like Erich Auerbach and George Steiner, who I idolized. All of this stuff was systematically being, for the time of my undergraduate and graduate study, being put to the torch, as it seemed. Collective effervescence, revolutionary enthusiasm was everywhere. New languages, new perspectives, new eruptions, new things every day to be horrified by. We heard that in Cambridge, the entire faculty was suspended in order to investigate the case of a post-structuralist in their midst. So I compare this with the experience of newcomers to my discipline, or any discipline in the humanities, today, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century. Although there are palpably many mansions in the house of the humanities, I think we would agree there is little sense either of walls falling or perhaps of serious construction work. We speak nowadays quite often of young people we call digital natives. Arrivals on the scene of the humanities nowadays could be called theory natives. So much theory natives, this incandescent, terrifying word through the last decades of the 20th century, so much theory natives that talk of theory as opposed to what, one might say, might seem oddly antique. So I think that as part of our thinking about the humanities, I think we have to acknowledge the unmistakable signs of settling in and convergence. Now, convergence is what you do as the director of a research center. You try and get a large and potentially very turbulent family to play nicely. It's not a good idea to have very settled opinions about what you think is good and what you think is bad, because what you think is bad sometimes is the kind of thing that gets funded. And anyway, what's not to like in convergence? Why can't we all just get along? Well, convergence can turn into a kind of optimization, and the kind of optimization that can itself become entropic. Now, I think there are 2 elements to this, and I just want to talk about 2 words. They've been talked about already, and we'll probably carry on talking about them in the next 45 minutes or so. The humanities and interdisciplinarity. So first of all, I think we need to talk about the consolidation of the humanities. The humanities as a phrase doesn't seem to, or a conception, doesn't seem to arise much before the 1760s. One of the earliest appearances, did you know, of the phrase the humanities occurs in all places in Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, where Boulogne is said, a little bit improbably and probably as a joke, to contain the finest seminary for the humanities. The plural, the humanities, probably arises as a floating off of the adjectival part of the Oxford course in classics known as literae humaniores, and partly also, I would guess, as a result of the rise of separate academic specialisms like classics, English, history, law, philosophy, and so on. The rise of scientific research, first of all in Germany, then in the USA, and then very belatedly in Oxford and Cambridge, gave a new meaning to the humanities, which is anticipated actually by Francis Bacon, who in the advancement of knowledge distinguished what he called three knowledges: divine philosophy, natural philosophy, and human philosophy or humanity. Well, divine philosophy hasn't dropped out of the picture, but I think we can say it's been largely assimilated to Bacon's human philosophy, resulting in the humanities being in some sense conceived as some sort of alternative to, or more cheerfully co-partner with, the sciences. But in Britain, at least, the humanities have had a cognate which is there in the name of CRASSH, and sometimes in a sort of polite stutter, in the arts and humanities. It seems to me that one of the things you might notice over the last 30, 40 years or so is that the faculties of arts that used to be seen in almost every university have silently become faculties of humanities. In a curious way, you might say that the arts are the kind of red squirrel being driven out by the grey squirrel, elegant creature though it is in its way, of the humanities. What work does the phrase the humanities now do? Well, it seems to me that it does a certain kind of work of making the humanities equivalent to the sciences in their technical engineering rather than contemplative or philosophical aspect. And it's very much part of the claim and the desire to assert the growing importance of importance. At the same time, I think we have a new and oddly, bizarrely coercive notion of interdisciplinarity, of a kind of in principle interdisciplinarity, which is not strategic, which doesn't arise in the way in which Simon evoked as a necessity of a particular kind of conjuncture, a particular kind of predicament that requires you to make collaborations, but as a kind of general outlook, a kind of universal intertranslatability based upon a shared sense, or a sense that there should be a deeply shared sense of method and language. If you read as many applications of all kinds as I do, and I know Simon does, and perhaps Mary and Ludmilla slightly less, but I'm sure they read plenty, you will know that you dare not proclaim yourself interdisciplinary if you want any kind of funding. Saying that you're against interdisciplinarity would be like declaring yourself against the fairies at the end of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. There is another mode of the interdisciplinary, one that is not so much of a way for the humanities to circle the wagons, as it were, and tell itself what it is. Because it seems to me that there might be a way and there might be a future, and I would like there to be a future in which interdisciplinarity and the kind of interdisciplinarity in which the humanities might engage would not be there to smooth the passage of things, but to attend at difficult births. The bringing about of new kinds of method, new modes of questioning that might in their turn bring into being new kinds of object. Think of the way in which microscopy brings into view a realm of nanomaterials that turn out not to be just the same as other kinds of stuff, only smaller, but to constitute a whole different kind of world. It seems to me that those different kinds of worlds can come into being with the more genuinely inventive kinds of interdisciplinary collaboration and conjuncture that I hope will come into being. And these are conjunctures that I think absolutely have to take place across what we have thought of previously up until now as the sciences and the humanities, simply because none of the questions as Simon has so rightly said, that are most important to us and are going to continue to be most important. Questions to do with medicine or with technology or with forms of communication. None of those belong exclusively to either side of that particular divide.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve, and indeed to all of you. I think that gives us a really nice set of questions to work with. I think the first point would be to say, I would encourage, I see that one question has already come in on the Q&A. Please do, participants, put in any questions you may have to all or to individuals on the panel. But initially, I'd like to invite the four of you really to maybe to respond to each other, to points that have been made. Yes.
Can I start off? Listening to all the talks, and thank you to my colleagues, I'm very struck that we're navigating talking at a number of different levels. And of course, Steve alluded to that quite explicitly by talking about a nano level. And I think it's easy in the context of humanities and social sciences centers to talk at very general levels. But what about at more specific levels? And I was really struck by Mary's comment about universities and localities. Because for me, moving as I did in 2013 to a university in the Northeast completely changed my views about the relationship between universities and their hinterlands. And so I found Mary's example about the Mellon-funded project, where the university was trying to integrate itself into a local community and encouraging the reciprocal process. Very, very interesting. And I wondered if we might want to think about this question of levels, but I think we might want to say that one of the things that can make us most energized is for some of these grand aspirations to have really localized payoffs. So I'd be interested to know what my colleagues think about that.
Well, I don't mind saying a word on that. The first is, I think, in general, my experience of Russell Group universities is that they are not only extremely poor at the sort of integration you're talking about, but positively opposed to it in their sense of what is the space of an academic. And I heard quite often people claiming that their natural right was not to be disturbed by anything from outside, which I think is, it's a familiar, but I think unacceptable position to adopt. I should say that at the moment, when my current job as Foreign Secretary of the British Academy, I distribute a huge amount of money on research funding, 23 million a year, almost all of which is involved in a sort of instrumentality because of the nature of the funding. And what's interesting about that is partly to answer a question of I don't know, I'll say Dr. Holliman, I don't know, are there any examples of successful STEM shape interactions? Well, there are a huge number, actually, going all the way back to how does disease get cured in Africa? How do we deal with the previous outbreak, where it only turned out that the disease could be cured after the anthropologist actually explained about what was happening with the bodies. Then we could actually get the medicine to work. Neither side could do it without each other. And when it comes to, as it were, climate change, the most obvious example, the idea that you can change the way people relate to their use of fuels and systems without thinking about social psychology or behavioral modes is just crass. It's just crass. And yet it's quite often done in that fashion, particularly by governmental agencies. And in the same way, at the moment, people are talking about vaccines. And level of explanation of what is a vaccine even. Do we count it as a vaccine if it only works for 83% and has to be done every 3 months, and et cetera, and what people are going to think about it, and why they aren't doing it, and how sensible it is or isn't not to get a vaccine? There are complicated arguments where we really need the work of the explanation that is non-material. There is no way that you change the minds of people who believe that vaccines are dangerous by presenting them with more facts. That's not how it works. It's just not what it's going to do. So, as it were, you need to have a much broader sense of what social communication is, to go back to one of Steve's questions, if we're going to get there. So it seems to me there are huge numbers of examples of where STEM and SHAPE need to relate to each other very, very strongly. And that for me is going beyond the local. That's all I would say, is I'm also interested not just in the local, but in fact thinking about our international responsibilities, which come in a post-colonial world, but also just come because we're human. And it seems to me that that's something we should be doing, and doing very strongly.
I guess the question is to what extent that might be a tension. You know, the local or the regional as a field of responsibility, say for a humanities center, and those kinds of more global reach. And of course, also through digital modes. I don't know, I haven't had a chance to see where our participants today are actually seated, but the reach that is possible, and then the balance between those two things, it might be a little bit akin to the balance between discipline and interdiscipline. You need to have both, as it were. Interdisciplinarity of a good kind needs a kind of disciplinarity. What kind of globalism should there be for a humanities center? And does that also have to be embedded or in a kind of responsibility to the more local?
It's interesting that the most successful lecture we had at CRASSH in my time in terms of outreach was a lecture on music, bizarrely, which uploaded as an hour-long lecture was seen by 125,000 people. Now, I'm very impressed if any of us have sold 125,000 copies of any of our books, let alone attended a lecture. That to me is decent outreach. And it is international, as you say, but it stemmed from a very local interaction.
But the interaction is going to be different when it's mediated digitally. And I guess the opportunity for local engagement may suggest, on a quasi-anthropological model, a deeper understanding of how the kinds of knowledge and debates we have in universities can infuse communities and vice versa.
I think that we have a huge role, but not just us, and not us in particular, but us included, in that work that Simon evoked as the kind of imagining of the better. I can't help thinking about the British comedy series W1A, which actually has somebody in the BBC. They imagine somebody is appointed as the chief, or the head of better. But in a certain kind of way, I think that really ancient classical idea that you need to work, you need in a certain sense to engineer your own understanding and imagination of what it means to live well, is an important but unignorable part of all of our existences now. You know, as we live in a statisticized world, there must be a better word than that, surely. But you know, everyone knows what I mean by that. You know, this is another episode in the comparatively recent work of adjusting ourselves to probabilities. Now, human beings had hardly any understanding at all of probabilities before the 1640s or so. They understood chance, and they understood unpredictability, and they had a notion of destiny. But there wasn't, as it were, a calculable region in between destiny and unpredictability. We now have that calculable region because we have conversations about there being a 20% chance of rain. And like everybody else, I don't know whether that means it's almost certain it's going to be a sort of 20% shower, or whether 4 times out of 5 I'm going to get away, with a dry picnic. Same with vaccines. How actually do we fold ourselves round? How do we live, or how do we, I like this phrase that Jean-Paul Sartre uses, how do we transitively exist conditions like this? Not how do we exist with them, how do we exist the condition of risk and probability that is all, in a certain sense, our responsibility. We've been precipitated as though in some extraordinary, Douglas Adams-like experiment effected by mice on another planet, we've been precipitated into a world of pure communications in which the most corporeal thing that happens to us is the act of communicating. What will that be like? How will we, what will it be like to live under those circumstances? Is the question that seems to me to be, luckily, both interesting and important at the moment.
I could pick up on some of the things that all the speakers have said, and just comment. CRASSH ran a year-long project on risk. It also ran a several-year-long project on not interdisciplinarity, but disciplinary innovation. That is change in the disciplines. And the disciplines are not static, and we all know that. So I'm a little surprised that we're going back to this question of, what does it mean to put 5 people from different disciplines in the room? And how does it change things? I think it changes the disciplines. And that's a really important part of what might happen. So I'd just like to mention those, and also take up a very interesting question that was raised by Simon, and in a different way by Ludi. Simon used this word instrumentality, which certainly in my own campaigning split personality, I have to say down with instrumentality, but you put a very interesting spin on it, which was to think of it as, how do we actually do this? How do we imagine? How do we practice the humanities? Going back to risk, one of the idiotic things that universities have started doing, and probably still do, is ask you to do a risk assessment for your own institution. And at the time when I was at Cambridge, the risk that there would be no students was kind of thought to be absurd, just a non-question. There'll always be students. Well, now we have a university where there are no students. They're at home, they're on Zoom, they're sequestered in their rooms. I've been taking Zoom courses and also meeting with graduate students who happen to be in many countries, not in America, not at Africa necessarily at all. So we have a dispersed form of communication with our students, which is a totally new phenomenon, has required them and us to be much better on Zoom, for instance. And the practice of the humanities and of getting the 5 people in the room is, I think, now going to be forever different. I don't think we're going to go back now. I think it's going to be very difficult to charge students a lot of money in order to have what's called the university experience. I think it's going to be difficult to persuade, especially younger academics who've not yet been vaccinated for whatever reason, to travel long distances to go to conferences. So I think when we talk about humanities in the time of COVID, or when I talk about it, I do actually mean something like what Simon has tried to suggest is the great problem. How do you do it? And I think the same goes for the question of the university's relation to itself and to its communities. And I use that in a rather wide sense, because I think the community of, Latinx or Black activists in Baltimore is a little bit different from what good old British regionalism. It may have some of the same aspects, lack of work, closing of factories, and so on and so forth. But I think it complicates our view of what the relation is between the quote local and the global. And I don't totally accept those oppositions. Actually, I think it's much more complicated, because the local is now the global. Parts for cars come from all sorts of places. Parts for our G4, G5 comes from China. So we really have to rethink a lot now, I think, about what we mean by even a global university, which has been a claim that universities have wanted to make for themselves. This is a global university. In Cambridge, I think, uniquely well positioned actually to make that claim, but it's now in a country which has decided it doesn't want to belong to a larger funding and humanities and STEM community, the European Research Council, for instance. So perhaps we should add Brexit to our list of things, but the complexity of squaring these different circles, I think, in itself requires a lot of thought, and this, the word that Steve has used, imagination. I don't think utopianism, but I do think that we face something absolutely unparalleled at the moment. And if we can't, if the humanities, our practice of the humanities cannot engage with that, we might as well say, well, the humanities are not for much.
Yeah. I wonder if I could respond to a couple of the questions that have been put. One from,
Yeah, I think now would be a good time to.
Yeah.
And this really, I mean, since we've been talking, Mary's been talking about students and whether they're, you know, where they are and whether they are present. Patrick and Timon, hello, Patrick and Timon, asked questions about undergraduates. How should undergraduate students best be introduced to the humanities if they're studying in areas outside? There are lots of precedents for this, making medics read War and Peace, that kind of thing is well established, perhaps not all that successful. Timon asks, are there ideas of creating interdisciplinary undergraduate courses at Oxbridge? I mean, my feeling is that it's very important actually to get away from the rather pathological sense, which is particularly pathological in Britain, that when you choose to specialize in a subject, you then have to personify it. That is to say that you are you make a profession. Interesting word that has an interestingly religious history of the subject that you spend time with. Well, I think that's a waste of a life. You know, you've only got one life. You need to understand and be interested in and inform yourself about as many different things as you want to, and you should be interested in them. And the notion that in a certain way you become formed and locked into a particular vocation by dint of being a literary scholar or by dint of being a mathematician, such that you can't pay any attention to anything else. It's really bonkers, but tremendously powerful in the educational system in this country, and I suspect in many other countries. Now, it does you a huge amount of good to spend a lot of time specializing in things. I really don't want interdisciplinary dentists or airline pilots anytime soon. I want there to be that kind of expertise, but I don't want my dentists or airline pilots never to think about probability or epidemics or religious faith. So I think that's the point. The point is that we need to get away from the notion that we personify our professions.
There are a whole range of questions being asked, and I wonder, Andrew, whether you might guide us through them. And some of them are a lot more conceptually complex than others. I mean, on the question, I noticed there are a lot of questions about training and so on. And I do think that there are fields like history and philosophy of science and science studies, which have been doing some of this kind of thing for decades. So we have models to draw on. But I think there are other questions. I mean, I'm thinking especially of Clive Sherlock's question, which raises some really profound issues. And I'm not quite sure how we might tackle this now. But then there are sort of intermediate kind of questions around policy and the media, for example, from Eve Patton and Alice Taylor. And I don't know, Andrew, if you'd like to guide us in responding to some.
Can I suggest that I was about to put that question of Eve Patton's from our sister institution in Dublin to you all, and maybe to you in particular, Ludmilla, that is through your reference to policy in the broadest sense in relation to collaboration with social sciences. Do you think that the Institute should also speak to policy in its narrow sense, i.e. attempt to address government directly on specific policy issues? And does this compromise academic independence? I think it's a good question for all of us. So
it's a brilliant question, and thank you for asking it. And of course, a certain amount hinges on this definition of policy. And I feel the answer is yes, we should be engaging with governments. I think we have a lot to offer. Can I say I learned a lot of this from one of my daughters, who's a historian and interested in policy. The UK Treasury used to have a history unit in it. So again, these are not new ideas. And I don't think we're compromised by it, or we're not automatically compromised by it. But I do think there's a little bit to play for in what we're counting as policy. So for example, in the fields I work in, the network in which Cambridge has been very involved, called History and Policy, is a really significant initiative. But if you look at the History and Policy website, you'll see that it's much stronger in some areas than others. And I must admit, I didn't check it just before this meeting, but certainly when I was checking it, areas like cultural policy were not so much to the forefront. But actually, if we're going to address some of these big questions that people have been invoking, the role of museums, for example, could be absolutely fundamental. So to have a good understanding, for example, about what's currently going on in DCMS, which I think is probably pretty concerning, actually would be an example of somewhere where we might want to get involved and to get ourselves up to speed, not just on what's going on in major government departments, but in ways that we might be able to contribute to the discussions.
Can I just say that on again, going back to the British Academy, it's exactly what we do already. So
yes, of course you do.
A series of meetings regularly with the Home Office and with the Treasury, in which invited academics meet with the policy people precisely to affect. The last one I chaired was on protest, which couldn't be more opposite right now, about thinking about what the concept of protest was. And I'd much rather have a bunch of humanities and social science scholars there than simply a bunch of officials. You know, you've got to actually have some
absolutely
intellectual work into what a protest is, and what the levels of acceptability, what the graves are, where, you know, do we have a blanket allowance, etc. And it was important that had absolute policy implications for which one could have an impact. And we do a lot of those sort of work, and it revolves around that. And I suppose it's partly not everybody needs to do that, but it is crucial that the expertise that is available at the university has a value that can actually be instrumental, not in the naive way. What's incredibly important is to realize that you can't expect to go into a meeting and say, I want X, X happens, X has the following social impact. It just doesn't work like that in the world, and we know it doesn't. So we have to be doing the work to see how it's instrumental, where it's instrumental, what we can do, and building up those relationships. And so, you know, in a sense, to answer Alice, I don't know if that's Alice Taylor, my old friend Alice Taylor, medievalist. If it is, lovely to see you. And yes, absolutely. Some academics are perfectly designed to do media interventions and need to be trained and encouraged to do so, because it does make a huge difference. The question is, you know, first of all, who's going to do the training? It'd be nice to get some training. And secondly, of course, it's not up for everybody. And I don't think it should be, as it were, a criterion necessarily of every appointment is, can you do a good blog? I think there are perfectly good researchers who are, frankly, autistic in other respects and shouldn't be doing this, you know, and that's perfectly okay. But I do think we need to change our attitude in the university towards saying that that's actually a valued bit of work.
But I think the difference in our emphasis, Simon, is that I think I'm interested in a wider range of academics having an understanding of these questions. So that you could say, for example, that to train a historian, you might want to train them in the ways that they might interact with government. And my experience is that actually, on the whole, people don't know much about this. And obviously you're in a very privileged position in the British Academy. Don't know very much about this, and B, can't quite see why it's important. So one of the real transformations of my time in Durham has been learning how to work with local government.
Yes.
And actually we have the most extraordinary council in Durham, which thinks that it wants to work with people in the cultural sector broadly defined. And I find that incredibly inspiring. They believe that in deprived parts of the country, a priority should be offering people cultural opportunities. And it's having the understanding and the capacity to then really work in that way, as well as on the big questions. And I love your questions about what is a good city, and what follows is what is a good citizen. And that all brings architecture in, and to some degree, perhaps this question of a good citizen might help respond to Clive Sherlock's points.
Yes. And just to remember that, if we're going to the 19th century and we think of Macaulay and Grote as the two of the greatest English historians of the time, both of whom are desperately involved in politics, deeply involved.
I think it was just crossing my mind as well that might be part of an answer to Clive Sherlock's question, which is a question about self-interest, I guess, and self-interest at the level maybe of aggression and greed. I mean, if that's a problem for the social order, which the humanities can be particularly helpful in addressing, then there's the question of our own communities and our own types of self-interest. And that links with Miranda Griffin's question, which I'd like to put to the four of you. At the level of university organization, and in a pragmatic way, how do we support and reward the kind of generosity and empathy necessary for authentic interdisciplinarity in order to foster creative dialogue and vital in imagination? So that question about what you might have to give up in order to be interdisciplinary, a kind of necessary empathy, which maybe has to put self-interest in a different position. It may be that we think that in the interdisciplinary is actually serves self-interest in some cases, but the collaboration presumably always requires a kind of putting of self-interest into a different kind of structure. So does anyone have thoughts about that, organizationally or in terms of the dynamics of collaboration in a seminar or whatever?
Well, two things we always say is trust and time. You need both. That's to say, the most important thing of interdisciplinarity is not only expertise, as Steve mentioned, but also the confession of ignorance. You actually have to be able to say, I don't know what that is. And somebody has to explain it to you and take the time to do so. And for most academics to confess their ignorance in public, or at least in the private space of a seminar, is a very difficult thing to do. And that revolves with trusting other people not to make fun of you, not to be arrogant, not to be nasty. And that sort of generosity of spirit is something that should be a valued quality in academia. It rarely is. But I mean, if I can just literalize it, I remember the first time I did one of these major problems, sitting in a room, and Jim Secord, one of the greatest historians of science in the university, said about a text we were looking at, "What's that?" And both Mary Beard and I, who were part of the team, said, well, quote from Horace. Don't you know Horace? I mean, everybody in the 19th century knew Horace. I mean, come on, it's obvious. And then I said, well, what's this? And he said, well, that's the balance of payments argument. Do you know nothing about economics? I go, well, no. Thanks, tell me. And you have to have that given, you have to have that trust to show your work, to show your ignorance, to do that. And that takes time to learn each other's languages. And I think that's something that universities and particularly funding bodies are very bad at. Can you turn this project round in 9 months? No, can't get going. And it's not about laziness, it's about learning languages and about sharing space and learning to trust each other. So I always like a good 5-year project, me. I think that's the way to do it. It's a simple answer, 5 years, 10 people, lots of money and lots of time.
But I make the same comment to Simon. We need to think about business as usual in universities. And I think we need to think about how heads of department and heads of faculties and heads of universities can inculcate communities that have that kind of generosity, that allow people to thrive and allow them time perhaps to work with local communities if that's what they want to do. And I think we're very far from that, especially in the run up to REF submissions. And I think someone said how, I think Mary said how reinforced the point I was making about how difficult it is for early career researchers. Heavens, who would want to be, I dare say there are people watching here who are in the early stages of their career. And I absolutely think it behoves us who've had enormously privileged situations and jobs to pay attention to what that's like, and to offer the generosity to people at the very start of their career so that they can then build it into the way that they work over decades.
I agree.
I suspect that we may need to sacrifice and may come to see the huge advantage in sacrificing that those special conditions that attach to being an academic, a career academic, in an institution like a university, which remains in many essential features the same as it has been for centuries, especially in places that have been there for centuries, like Cambridge. It seems to me that this relates to the policy question, because if you think about working on policy questions, on local problems or national problems, and you think of it in terms of, well, this is a bit of expert knowledge that we can feed in and then you make a decision. That relies upon this kind of very fundamental division of spheres. In fact, though, the best conversations are ones that make a university much more porous to the outside world, in a way in which universities, really are. Universities economically have become much more diverse kinds of things. If you're a vice chancellor, you've got to be a property developer, you've got to be all kinds of things, apart from a headmaster, which is what might have been the case several centuries ago. But we need, I think, to make universities not places that you retire to in perpetuity, which is what most young researchers crave, which is what I craved. But universities should be places that people come in and out of, as students do. And that should include people in government. That should include clerics. That should include everybody. That is a really utopian vision, but actually it's also the only way in which, once things improve, we're actually going to be able to provide the levels of lifelong education, a rather musty phrase we don't hear very much anymore, but the lifelong education that human beings will continue unstoppably to demand. Universities need to become much more porous and much less set apart. Actually, I hope that CRASSH does as good a job as anything does in Cambridge. I mean, Cambridge is the most economically divided city in the UK. But if we have a public in the University of Cambridge, that public tends in better times to be coming into the Alison Richard building for the kinds of events that CRASSH is putting on.
Yeah, Mary, I was about to invite you back in, but you respond. Yes. And
it's interesting that we found ourselves talking about the role of the university. I want to come back to the role of the Humanities Centre because it's really precarious, and we know that. We know that there are funding problems. We know that universities foster them if they have the kind of enthusiasm that Ludmilla has described for making connections with their community, or we know that universities foster them because they're instrumental, to use the term in a negative way, in getting grants. And I still think that humanities centres have, although very firmly established in some places and some universities, are marginal. And that in the interest of changing universities, we should think about that marginality as a danger, as a problem for the future. I'm not sure now, I'm sufficiently out of touch with CRASH to know whether the long-term goals of CRASH have been attained in terms of recognition. I'm sorry to think that, for instance, the initial enthusiasm for having something that really bridges the social sciences may have been kind of whittled away a little bit through a university organization of accounting, basically, as simple as that. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about not only the humanities, but the Humanities Center. What is the Humanities Center for?
I agree. I've been to a lot of meetings on this over the last 20 years, it seems. And I think there was a model which was embodied early in the Prince Institute of Advanced Studies that said the Humanities Center provided a haven for blue skies thinking where individuals went on their own. I think that's an outmoded model. I think it's absolutely wrong. And I think Steve's model of porosity is exactly the right model in the direction to be going. But what it requires and requires arguing for is actually a university thinking that has a sense of flexibility about careers and about duties. That, as it were, we have an obsession in Cambridge, it seems to me, with undergraduate teaching that's completely misplaced. I mean, yes, we have to teach undergraduates, but the idea that the only thing you do in a university is undergraduate teaching is just silly. We do lots of other things, and we have to balance those interests at various points in our career and our times. And that's not about saying, let's have teachers or researchers. No, it's about everybody who wants to have a more portfolio career and be respected for it and being supported for it. And I think that's part of, that's a necessary grounds for what Steve wants. If you're going to go and build up relationships on a policy level, locally or elsewhere, that's a big, you can't do that in 10 minutes. That takes a lot of your time. And there has to be a consequence of that, of what you can do elsewhere. And we have to recognize the value of that. In the same way, to answer Alice's question, if we're going to have people who are going to be serious about doing media work, that takes time and takes you away from other things. And we have to think of that as being valued rather than, oh, well, that's what you do. You have to do everything else as well. And I think it's very hard for people to change that shift, to change that attitude.
Could I bring us?
So, Simon, leaving aside the portfolio career, what is the function of the Humanities Center, CRASH, in the university?
You want me to? I mean, Steve, is you?
No, I think it's a question for all of us. I mean, I thought about it a lot, and I didn't necessarily come up. I had some thoughts about this, as we all do, but I think it's urgent.
Well, I think that Simon is right about the the location, or as it were, the aspect of the Humanities Center. You know what? When you go around different universities, especially American universities, but not exclusively, the geography of the research center is very interesting. They are very often literally peripheral. They're on the edge of the campus in some leafy, very comfortable part of it, or they may be on the 5th floor of a rather grand building. I think it's, I mean, we benefit in Cambridge from being in the building with the cafe. So, we're aptly named because people bump into each other a lot accidentally. That model of the Humanities Center as a special kind of space apart, a place for specialized reflection, I think is indeed outmoded. It's also boring. It's much more interesting, in fact, to be on the shop front and to be, as it were, on the street, because I think that that physically as well as institutionally and functionally gives you more opportunities. But it is also the case that we need, there isn't one model. There needs to be flexible and mixed economy in all these things. So let us take what in the UK is called the impact agenda. Young researchers spend inordinate amounts of their time thinking about how they can tell people about their research and drum up more or less factitious measures of how they have changed people's lives or minds or actions. And large amounts of money depends upon being able to produce these fictions. And the fact is, if everybody is told that they have to have impact with their research, which is measurable in these fiddling ways, then everybody will come up with the pseudo evidence for it, and there won't really be any impact. So the fact is, not everybody can have impact all the time. And we just need to accept that. Not everybody can be on television all the time or conducting Zoominars all the time. But we do have opportunities to think about a kind of economy that includes restraint as well as endless expansion. And sometimes we might think, what should we do less of?
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to bring us maybe a couple more questions in, and specifically maybe, I mean, one of the largest questions of potential impact would be Clifton Emery's question about the humanities, and maybe let's say the Humanities Centre, for the sake of argument, have an obligation to respond to the new challenges to liberal democracy? And if so, what does that response need to look like? This comes back to what you were saying, Mary, and where you're sitting indeed over in the USA, but of course, it's a more general question than that. Do any of you have thoughts about it? It's a big question.
Well, there's two different answers to the question. One of them is to focus on what Mary said. What's a research centre for? And I would like to think that one of the ways we could answer that is, well, you know, CRASSH was one of the first places to have a full-scale, large project on conspiracy theory. And that's not a subject that fits into any university discipline. And that was our value, that we could put the people together, we could get the money, we could then run it for 6-7 years as we did. And it was hugely influential, and it helps understand something about the way in which democracy does and doesn't work, both historically and today. And I think that was something that only a research centre could provide. There was no disciplinary focus that could give it, no faculty that could give it that. And I think that's a very important part of what we do to escape those silos that Andrew said right at the second. But I also think one of the simplest answers, and it's, I'm going to say something deeply unfashionable, but hugely felt. And that is that one of the best answers to the questions, what do you teach, is people. You know, instead of answering subjects, you know, I teach people. And one should never forget that there is an exemplarity in the way that we produce our work, the way we teach people, the way we go ahead, whatever you're teaching, that is crucial to the production of a good citizen. And actually, if that happens to be the case of the evaluation of evidence and the evaluation of fact, that's an important part of what any subject the university teaches, and teaches well. And there is a direct relation, we know, statistically. This is not a snobbish remark, but there is a statistical relation between university education and those who are attacking democracy in America at the moment, and it's an inverse relation. Right? And so I think we shouldn't be afraid of saying that the Humboldtian idea of building has a lot of problems, for sure. And we're not going to go back to the early 19th century, but we still teach people and shouldn't be ashamed of that and say that that's a good thing that we do. And what they learn from us is a transferable skill called citizenship. And I know it's very unfashionable to say some of those things, but I believe that quite passionately.
Well, one could say that it's also a co-learning, and that would make it maybe a little bit more fashionable. But,
yeah, okay. Yeah, I'd certainly learn from students, that's for sure.
But it isn't that co-learning is fashionable. It is that co-learning captures some real phenomenon.
Yeah.
So given what we've said about the humanities and their wider role, logically, we must say that Humanities Centre can address these problems. And surely the way to address these problems is for humanities centres to have regular series of discussions, debates, seminars, and so on that are open for all, that give people the kind of tools to evaluate the sort of claims that are constantly being made. I mean, I think we're living in a time when it's very hard to read the news without wanting to burst into tears. Now, what might it take to change that? And that has to be growing from the ground up. I think. So maybe that will be a public purpose for humanities centres to grow some of these, what Simon is calling transferable skills, but I think we can, there are a whole range of vocabularies that we can use for them, and I think that will be really inspiring.
I think we also need to be clear that we're not necessarily and have not necessarily been on the right side of history on this, because it's certainly the case that in the humanities there has been a sustained, sinuous, and very successful assault on many of the principles of liberalism. I mean, it was regarded as a swear word when I was a student to be a liberal. And that's partly because the word means so many different things in the mouths of so many different people. But I think there can be no doubt that there is a brand of authoritarian liberalism which does much of the same work as anti-liberal authoritarianism.
Well, I want to come back to this question of people. And Simon is so right. We teach people, but we do teach them what we have had some experience in thinking about, and that's important. But and I think Ludi is right on. This past week, maybe it's 2 weeks in America, has produced this extraordinary sense of crisis, unbelievable, in which the term liberal, of course, is assimilated in America quite differently, assimilated very quickly to communism. Yes, as we all know, if you read the paper. So we have a problem with terminology. We have a problem with what kind of liberal values are espoused by universities. We also have a problem with who is in the university, and I mean the students. We know that there are enormous problems of access to universities from socially and ethnically disadvantaged people, as there also are enormous disparities in who gets COVID. And I feel really that, when in times of peculiar stress of the system, it's very important for humanities centers to be equal to a response. I think humanities centers are both in a position where they can be on the leading edge or look at blue skies on the horizons. And I couldn't agree more with Simon that I don't think they should be places of refuge for people who find universities too tumultuous. Our students, I think, if we have them, graduate students and undergraduates, are very committed, many of them. They may not all agree with us, we may not all agree with them, but they are very committed and they are very energizing. And I think you can see that particularly in the work that early career researchers choose to do, actually. And you see that in the CRASSH network groups. And I think tapping into those energies, and those energies which are in a way for change, but also for responsiveness to things that are happening to them, to their relatives, to their families, to their own careers, is just tremendously important. So I don't think it's only a question of lamenting something that has happened to ideas about liberalism. I think we should define what those ideas are. I mean, Herbert Hart would have a quite different way of defining liberalism. It means something like working within the framework of laws. But as we know, law is malleable, and like the disciplines and changes. And I think in order to tap into those tremendous commitments, enthusiasms, energies, which we bring to our own work, I think we all have done the work we wanted to do because of commitments. And those commitments have changed. But I think that's an incredibly important driver, more so than funding, because often it's unfundable, in what we individually have done with our careers at the end. And you can look back at the end of your career and say, well, why did I do that? I did that. Oh, I went out on a limb. I think humanities centers have to find a way, not to go out on a limb, but to be responsive to the concerns of what you have to say are our constituency. And that constituency is the most important. They are the people that Simon is talking about. They're the people who come in with a project, the people who want us to do or want the Centre to do something particular, have a conference, whatever it may be. So another way of thinking about the relation of the Humanities Centre to its community.
Thanks very much, Mary. I think that actually might be a very appropriate place at which we should finish. We have run out of time. Time has gone very quickly with the dynamics of the discussion. I should apologize to a couple of people whose questions haven't been addressed, but individuals might well like to take a look at those if they haven't already, from Matt Parry and Amkrulis, which are also important questions. And those questions will percolate on through the anniversary year, through CRASH, and of course more widely. I'd like to finish by, of course, warmly thanking our four speakers, the directors, for I think a tremendous engagement with these questions about humanities futures. I'd like to echo what Ludmilla first said about the administrative staff at CRASH and the huge amount that they've devoted. Also, I know in my own year's experience as interim director, the huge amount that they've devoted to the success of the operation and will continue to do in the future, and also to the huge collective of participants in CRASH activities over its first 20 years, some of whom have participated, no doubt, in today's webinar, but there are many thousands besides. And I think that's a meaningful collective. I think people have a strong sense of CRASH as having made a difference for themselves and their careers in whatever ways, and through as it were micro communities within CRASH, but also as part of the macro community. And I'd like finally just to remind you in that spirit that details of the upcoming program for CRASH, and of course also anniversary activities of other kinds, can be found on the website crash.cam.ac.uk. And with a note of thanks very much once more to our four speakers and to all of you. Goodbye.